We've done it. We've reached the end of the Lost Agent arc, a storyline that was much shorter than the Arrancar saga that preceded it, but has been riveting, mysterious, and overall a very satisfying ride. And here, at the end, we get to the core conflict of this story, and the reason for its name, as two lost agents of the Soul Society finally face off. As we've learned recently, Ginjo wasn't just some Fullbringer, but was apparently the first ever substitute Soul Reaper, the one that they made the position for, and the guy that held the badge before Ichigo. As the arc has gone on, I just assumed that the name The Lost Agent arc was referring to Ichigo, but it's clear after all of this that it may not only be referring to how Ichigo was no longer a Soul Reaper, but also is referring to Ginjo himself too. With everything Ginjo put Ichigo through this arc and put me through with all of his trickery, this is a very, very personal fight. While Aizen may have known about Ichigo his whole life, they didn't spend much time together, and there wasn't the same sense of familiarity that we have between Ginjo and Ichigo. Ichigo thought of Ginjo as a friend and someone he could rely on, only to find out that it wasn't what he thought at all, but they still did spend all that time together, and Ginjo did help him through a lot of his issues before revealing his true nature. This relationship and the similarities between them gives this fight some really compelling weight. Both of these people are passionate and tough, as well as the only two substitute Soul Reapers, and now Ginjo has even taken Ichigo's Fullbring powers, practically flaunting it in his face since he's wearing the armor that Ichigo used to wear. I loved that Ginjo had Ichigo's spirit pressure and his abilities too after taking his Fullbring, like using the Ketsuga Tensho against him. It just helps reinforce the notion that these two guys are two sides of the same coin in a lot of ways, more similar than they are different. I've mentioned before how this story arc reminds me a bit of Yu Yu Hakusho's Chapter Black arc in some ways. Like the characters come back to the living world and are going about their normal lives after a big supernatural conflict. Human beings are revealed as developing abilities, but this relationship between Ichigo and Ginjo legitimately has so many echoes of that Yu Yu Hakusho arc in some ways, because it's our hero who's been given a supernatural job facing off against the man that held the position before him, who has since become the major antagonist. In both series, the villain is someone that has been in similar shoes as the protagonist, but made completely different choices or was put up against entirely different obstacles. Both of these villains were the protagonist once in a story set before the one that we're seeing. I'm not saying it's copying, it's certainly not doing that, but there's just some interesting parallels that I'm really enjoying, since I adore the Chapter Black arc in that series, and I've had such a great time with the Lost Agent arc in this one. Anyway, I loved that Uryu was present for this, even if he didn't contribute much to the end result. The first blood that was drawn in this arc was against Uryu, and now we know Ginjo was the one responsible, so it's just fitting that he's able to get some shots in considering what Ginjo did to him. But overall, this needed to be Ichigo's fight, and Ichigo's fight only. There was this really interesting revelation that was compelling in its own right, but I absolutely love the conclusion it led to, and it all centered on Ginjo stating the truth about the substitute Soul Reaper pass. That badge has been something of a staple in the series ever since Ichigo was first given it at the end of the Soul Society arc. Back then, it was a symbol of growth in his station, of starting to earn trust from people that were his enemies, and of his time as a Soul Reaper feeling fully accepted. Most importantly, it was something he earned after proving he was worthy of wearing those robes and wielding a Zanpakuto. He had turned his former enemies into like begrudging allies at least, if not more. It was validation for all of his effort as a substitute Soul Reaper since the beginning of the series. And in the Lost Agent arc, the substitute badge has carried a similar but altogether different kind of significance because of everything that happened. I've talked about it being like the last bit of evidence of Ichigo's time as a Soul Reaper once that part of his life seemed to be over, a relic of a bygone era. And then it being the item that had enough of an emotional significance for him him to tap into his Fullbring made it even more important. For a moment there, it was like the source of his power, what he needed to help find himself again. And now, we learn that the substitute Soul Reaper badge wasn't actually meant to just be a device that allowed you to be a substitute Soul Reaper, and it wasn't just evidence that you're sanctioned by Soul Society. No, its real function was to monitor and control the one that it was given to. That's obviously a bit of an uncomfortable revelation, but for me, not totally surprising. I've always kind of questioned some of Soul Society's intentions and their methods, from their treatment of the Quincy, for instance, in the past, and by extension having someone like Mayuri in their ranks at all, to how they jump to conclusions like with Urahara and the Visored, or how easily they were able to be manipulated by Aizen. Plus, I still think the final villain of Bleach could be the Soul King himself, so I've always been a bit sus about them, so it doesn't shock me, but Ginjo is adamant about how much he thinks this revelation should horrify Ichigo. And it's not a great look, for sure, but it does explain some little things, like hearing Rukia's voice through the badge a while ago, and how some of Ichigo's Soul Reaper power was within the badge because the badge had absorbed it. Stuff like that was interesting to get some explanation for. But I loved that Ginjo tries to use this revelation to mess with Ichigo's head, and instead, Ichigo is pretty unbothered by it. He sort of suspected it and accepted that, essentially, being monitored and potentially controlled by the Soul Society was just part of the gig, and that it was worth it if it meant he'd have the power to protect the people he loved. He was willing to have some oversight if it meant he would be able to protect people. We've always talked about how Ichigo's biggest desire isn't a position or something material, it's to be able to protect his loved ones, and this just continues to prove that that is what is most important to him above all else. He's willing to give up his privacy and even complete control of his own power, his own agency, and like spiritual autonomy if it means that he's still able to protect the people that he cares about. And this seems like something that Ginjo can't possibly comprehend. I'm trying to read between the lines a little since we aren't really shown anything definitive as far as his motivations, but I don't think Ginjo was able to make the same choice. I don't think he was able to accept what Ichigo accepts. I don't think he's motivated enough by the same things that Ichigo is. Despite how he seemed to care somewhat for the execution team, I don't think Ginjo would be able to stomach even the idea that someone was overseeing him closely and able to control his power if need be. Like, Ginjo obviously didn't like being monitored and controlled, which is fair enough on its own, but whatever resentment that caused, whatever animosity that caused between him and Soul Society has just rotted away who he is, and now he's been focused on gaining more power back ever since leaving them, I guess. I do have a small question about this though. So we know Ginjo quit as a substitute and disappeared and they weren't sure where he went, but we know he still had his substitute badge on him. So wouldn't they be able to both find him and listen in on what he was saying? Like, it was in his duffel bag. That was one of the first things we ever saw. So maybe they were listening and they did know where he was and it just wasn't a good time to strike. But they also talk about how they kind of turned to Ichigo in debate by giving him the badge, knowing that Ginjo would come knocking essentially at some point, and they were going to lure him out that way. I don't know, but it's a little weird knowing that he was in possession of the badge that apparently monitors the ones who have it, and yet nobody tracked him down with it. I don't know. I just think that's a little strange. There might be an explanation, it doesn't quite add up to me. I loved Ichigo's Bankai transformation destroying the digital plane they were stuck in. It's also a subtle but interesting new look for him, expanding on this like Soul Reaper Fullbring mix he's got going on. That new Bankai version of his Zanpakuto, by the way, also looks particularly deadly. Like, that's a dangerous looking Zangetsu. But he isn't the only one with Bankai, as Ginjo displays, and I really like how his design strays away from how he normally looks. It's still recognizably Ginjo, but with the palette change and in particular that interesting mark on his face, I have no idea what the significance of that is. It'd be easy to not realize this is Ginjo at first glance if you didn't know, but with the color swap, it kind of just heightens how creepy the skeletal armor is, because now it's looking a little like, bloody kind of vibes. There's also this really wonderful moment during these final parts of the fight where Ginjo is realizing that Ichigo didn't deny any of the problems that he has with the Soul Society. He didn't tell him, oh, you're wrong for being upset that they lied to you about the badge. Ichigo doesn't invalidate any of Ginjo's feelings. He just has accepted kind of the terms of being a Soul Reaper that Ginjo wasn't able to accept. But Ginjo's not wrong for feeling that way either. I'm sure many of us, myself included, would probably have an issue with the idea that the Soul Society might be restraining my power or might be watching me at any moment of the day. But I loved that Ginjo noticed that and that Ichigo behaved that way, because he's not the type of guy that's just gonna... It's not like Ichigo is known for falling in line with everything the Soul Society does. What I loved even more was that Ginjo noticed that Ichigo was trying to understand him, even in the midst of battle. Ichigo was trying to understand him, and we know that Ichigo, during combat, that's when he feels most connected to his opponent. That's when he can kind of feel what they're thinking, and he couldn't do that with Ginjo back when Ginjo was being altered by Tsukishima's power, which was interesting back then. But now, I'm sure Ichigo can feel what Ginjo's feeling, and I'm sure he understands what he's feeling, and yet, like Ginjo says, he denounces everything that he is. He's so similar to him and in such a similar position, but still doesn't agree with not with what he's thinking so much as how he's dealing with it. Ichigo is denouncing how Ginjo has reacted to the Soul Society's betrayal. He denounces what Ginjo has turned himself into, essentially, which I think is really powerful, really beautiful, that the main character isn't just like, no, you're wrong, and just beats him down. He really does try to understand where Ginjo's coming from. And I think that's really cool. I think that was a really cool moment for both these characters. And I just love that Ichigo is literally willing to do anything, even potentially give up his own control if it keeps people safe and happy. Ginjo wasn't willing to go that far, but that is exactly what gives Ichigo power and gives him the edge when he finally strikes Ginjo down. And here, at the end, I've got to say, I'm honestly a little disappointed that we didn't get a good look at Ginjo's time as a substitute Soul Reaper. Seeing the similarities or differences between his time in the role and Ichigo's would have just helped strengthen what is already a great dichotomy between them, besides also just getting some more information about that period and the circumstances around it. It feels like a little bit of a missed opportunity in that regard, but I don't think it hurt the messages here at the end too badly. I think it would have just enhanced them even more if we actually got to dive into some of that. Like, given all of the circumstances, I think it would have been very beneficial to actually see where all of this was coming from. It's still effective, but with added context, it would have hit even harder to really help that emotional crescendo. We've seen what Ichigo was like when he was no longer a Soul Reaper and what led him there. I think we should have seen a similar position for Ginjo. Like I talked about last video, we saw kind of a montage of a lot of the backstories of the rest of Execution besides Tsukishima, but Ginjo doesn't get even what they got. Like, each of them got like a couple pages worth of material. Ginjo's got like one image of him finding Tsukishima when he was a Soul Reaper and Tsukishima was like a kid. That's intriguing. I want to know what's going on there, you know? I just think it's just unfortunate that the two characters, the two big villains of the arc, we don't really get a good look at their past. I don't feel quite as strongly about Tsukishima not having a backstory as I do about Ginjo. I'm not as disappointed in that because I kind of like how that fits with Tsukishima. There's something poetic about a guy who changes people's past having an unknown history of his own. He pops up in so many people's lives, but we never see what his life was like. It just kind of adds to the whole mystique of, was he really here? You know, I think I talked about early in the arc, especially in the anime, it was treating him kind of like this ghost that was just kind of popping in and out, that would like walk by, but no one else seemed to really notice. You know, it's almost like he doesn't exist. And I think there's something really powerful about that, but I'll get into more of that in a bit when we come to his end. I actually don't mind that when it comes to Tsukishima, whereas Ginjo, I just feel it's so integral to who he is. His past is why he's doing all of this, is why he relates to Ichigo. It's who his character is, and we just don't see it enough. So yeah, that's why I feel like Tsukishima's, it's okay and actually kind of interesting that we don't see his past, whereas Ginjo, I think it's a mistake to not show it. But I don't think this is necessarily like a terrible thing. Like, I didn't have that problem with Aizen, but I think it's a little different here because of how these relationships intermingle, and most of all, I think seeing Ginjo's past, like I said, would be just beneficial for his whole relationship with Ichigo and how we're processing that relationship. It seems like we were given like 75% of Ginjo's story here without being told the specifics of where all this is really coming from. Sure, he didn't like being controlled or monitored or held back or whatever, but it just seems a little too simple and leaves so many questions up in the air. And maybe we'll get answers down the road, but I just feel like this would have hit so much harder if we fully understood Ginjo's perspective. If there was a time where it would have been great for Bleach to have a flashback, it would have been here. At least some snippets of it, a few panels of Ginjo's life as a Soul Reaper, of what that meant to lose it, of what it meant for him to be betrayed when he realized that they were monitoring him, to see what happened directly after. How did he deal with all of that? What led him to, take these extremes and to try to take Ichigo's power? It would have been nice. And it's just disappointing. It's a little disappointing. And I love everything we got here, but that added on would have made it even better. But no, Ginjo dies without getting a chance to really dive deep into his character, but I still loved his final moments as he wonders if things might have been different if he and Ichigo's roles were switched. Would Ichigo have made the same choices he did if he was a substitute Soul Reaper first? There's a real sense of regret in those last thoughts. And that's the end of Ginjo, who turned out to be the main villain of this Lost Agent storyline. And the story of this arc really centers around this concept of the two substitute Soul Reapers that are kind of adrift with no other ships in sight, and while Ichigo was kind of forced into powerlessness and isolation because of his defense of the Soul Society, Ginjo seemingly chose to leave them after learning the truth. They were both looking for new purpose, for new direction, anything that would help them deal with the circumstances that they were put in. Ichigo tried to move on to something more normal, while Ginjo dedicated his life to getting retribution against the ones that he felt used him. They were both lost, no longer what they used to be, but only one of them handled it well, while the other ended up being destroyed by it. If Ichigo had remained powerless for a prolonged period of time and unable to help his friends and hadn't been able to get his powers back, yes, maybe then we could talk about would he really have become as desperate as Ginjo and done things that Ginjo did. But thankfully, his relationship with the Soul Society was apparently much better than however Ginjo left. Don't burn bridges when you leave your job, You never know. Those referrals might come in handy in the future, or they might hire you back. I'm just saying, Ginjo. I did love the reveal that our squad of Soul Reaper allies weren't just here to help Ichigo, but also were here to potentially take him out if they had to, if he joined Ginjo and became an enemy. People like Rukia knew he wouldn't, obviously, but it just shows the seriousness of the situation, and it's no wonder they brought all of these guys when probably a couple of them could have taken out all of Execution on their own. Like, Kenny could have beat them. Maybe Tsukishima would have given him trouble. But I feel in my heart Kenny could have taken them all. But it's lovely that they see that Ichigo is trustworthy in the end and made the choice to not be like Ginjo. And when it seems like everything's over and done, Tsukishima pulls a Carl from Die Hard and pops up for one last chance of revenge. At first, I panicked when I saw Rukia getting in the way, only for it to turn out to be Raruka instead, who emerges from Rukia's chest like Capone from One Piece. So my fear of Raruka possessing her turned out to be unfounded, thankfully, and instead she was just hiding inside of her. I loved the idea that Raruka vocalizes that Ginjo was seen as a savior by the Fullbringers, but it was Ichigo that saved Ginjo in the end, by showing him a different path at what he could could have been before defeating the monster that he'd become. And I found Tsukishima's real end to be surprisingly poignant and a little endearing, considering how horrific and creepy his actions throughout the arc could be. In these last few chapters, we see that he was found by Ginjo when he was very young and alone in the world, and then we see Tsukishima's panicked reaction once Ginjo died, not knowing how to exist without him. It's pretty clear that he had an incredibly close bond to Ginjo, one that I'd say he maybe tried to replicate when he would use his Book of the End on people. When he inserted himself into people's past, he kind of gave himself this deeply influential role, no matter who he was changing, a position that made these people love him or be loyal to him, practically worship him sometimes, and do as he said out of sheer gratitude. I imagine that was like projection, you know, like that's what Ginjo was to him, considering his reaction to losing him. But it was sweet that Tsukishima seemed to have cultivated a real relationship with Shishigawara, and it didn't seem like it was the product of his Fullbring tampering with the past. It was a genuine bond of a mentor and an apprentice, which was what he and Ginjo's relationship kind of turned out to be. It's just kind of sweet that he realized that he wasn't actually alone, even with Ginjo gone. That he never really had been, because he had a real friend and a real loyal disciple in Shishigawara. So he didn't die alone. I wasn't expecting a death like that for him after everything, but it worked really well. His death makes the people he affected apparently forget about him, so he fades from their lives just like their false past do, and the only ones who'll remember him are the people he made actual memories with. What a great antagonist. And Ginjo as well was really great for this story. I'm also a little shocked that Jackie's alive in particular, but relieved as well, as the remaining members of Execution try to move on with their lives. And then there was Ichigo going to Soul Society to make sure Ginjo is laid to rest in the living world, and I loved how direct Ichigo was about this. And it was great to see some familiar faces, and we even saw some new captains. Some of the Visored have returned to their posts, with Kensei and Shinji back in their captain robes, and that kind of surprised me a little after everything they were put through for like a century, but I'm happy for them. I think that's really cool. I'm excited to see how they have adjusted to being back to their former lives, essentially, but good for them. I'm happy for the Visor that maybe the rest of them are there too. Maybe some of them stuck around on Earth. I don't know, but that's 2 captains that have been replaced. There's still a 3rd that we haven't seen who took up, because it was Aizen, Tozen, Gin. We still haven't seen the 3rd, so that'll be interesting. Maybe it's Hisagi on a motorcycle. As for Ichigo asking for Ginjo to be buried in the living world, I really love this as a cap off to the arc. This Lost Agent arc was anchored to the living world and centered on mortal human beings, and despite Ginjo kind of becoming a monster, in the end, he was a person who was a lot like Ichigo. So I really like that Ichigo made this effort to really put Ginjo to rest. I just realized that I haven't spoken about Ukitake, and there's some pretty interesting things here in this part of the story pertaining to him. He's always been portrayed as like one of the morally just and kind captains in the Soul Society, so that's suddenly put into question by Ginjo, since Ukitake was the one that gave the substitute badge, but I liked that he seemed to hint to Ichigo about its true purpose even back then. You know, he kind of revealed it without revealing it, which helped make Ichigo feel a bit better about it. You know, he felt like he wasn't being fully deceived by Ukitake about what the badge really was for. This whole thing helped to reinforce that there are good forces within the shadier aspects of the Soul Society, and Ukitake really does seem to be one of them. He seems like a true ally, and he's trying to navigate what is, you know, potentially not the most morally correct system. I really liked that little layer to the story. I never really doubted him, even when Ginjo was trying to make it seem like it. Ukitake just seems like a straight up good dude. I just really liked what this kind of said about the state of the Soul Society and who we can trust in an arc that was so much about paranoia. So really liked that. You know what's crazy to me is that it's kind of wild that this was the end of the original Bleach anime for like, what, a decade? More? That's crazy. I can't imagine how much that sucked that the next arc wasn't animated then. Did most of you who only watched the show jump over to the manga when you found that out? And did everyone at that point just give up hope that you'd ever see the anime cover more of the story? Because that's a pretty long gap to not have a conclusion in the anime while the manga carried on. No offense to any of you that suffered through that, but I'm glad I can move on to both the rest of the manga and the new anime from here. Speaking of which, my next video will be a discussion on how I plan to proceed. So look out for that, because I know a lot of people have wondered that since I first started making videos. So we're going to address that in my next video. The whole next video is going to be telling you all how I'm going to be going forward in this final arc. So look forward to that very soon. On the Lost Agent arc as a whole, I absolutely loved it. I would have even loved a bit more of it, but I can understand why it was shorter. In some ways, it felt like a really wonderful side adventure, and I think that worked really well as a reprieve from all of the drama in the Soul Society. I think this was an extremely important period for Ichigo, and I'm glad we took the time to actually explore his mindset, what he went through, how he got his powers back. I think this was very important for him as a character. I am endeared even more, and I already loved Ichigo, but after this arc, I really feel like I have a good understanding of every aspect of him, pretty much. He went through the ringer, and I have so much respect that he's okay, and I'm glad he's better than ever. This was great. It was a very different kind of arc. It was a nice change of pace. It was unique. It was interesting. A whole lot of new stuff coming at you, but I think it was effective to kind of be its own little bottled story, at least, unless the next arc is heavily tied into this one. I only have a few gripes with this arc, but nothing that damaged the story too badly or anything, obviously, considering how much I loved it. I already mentioned that I'm a little let down by the vagueness of Ginjo's past, and I am. I think I needed just a little more immersive personal push in his final stand, you know? It just feels weird that we learned more about most of the Fullbringers' backstories than his. I know more about Giriko than I know about Ginjo, which doesn't feel right. And considering how we know enough about Ginjo's to know that there was a lot of interesting stuff that we didn't see. I didn't need 5 chapters of flashbacks. I just needed something a little more, I think. The only other quibble I have with this arc is I feel there was a missed opportunity with Chad, and to a slightly lesser extent, Orihime. I was so excited that we were delving into humans with powers and explanations for that, since those two characters have had powers for most of the series with no real reason given at the time. And we did learn a lot about Fullbringers, but early on in the arc it felt like Chad was finally being given a bit of a spotlight. He's being pushed forward, but him being part of execution in the end was really just used to make them feel more trustworthy to Ichigo and to us, which is fine. I just think more could have been done with that and with Chad. He spent months with these people and never got a real resolution with any of them. He wasn't involved with the fights. He didn't have a moment of punching Ginjo or Tsukishima in the face. I just think that for an arc that focused on Fullbringers, there could have been a bit more focus on the people in our main cast that were already Fullbringers. I love everything we did with Ichigo here, and I loved the Soul Reaper's eventual role, but finding a bigger place for Chad and Orihime besides being, controlled by Tsukishima just would have been nice. But those issues I had don't really detract from what we're given too much, because what we got was pretty phenomenal. I enjoyed unraveling this mystery and found myself completely compelled by Ichigo's journey through this very challenging time of his life. I'll always appreciate the breath of fresh air that was the Lost Agent arc, or as Gandalf would say, the deep breath before the plunge, because I know the next arc is called 1,000-Year Blood War, and from that name alone, that sounds like it'll be a much larger conflict than this was, so I'm just gonna prepare for whatever we're about to get next, considering this is the final arc of Bleach. So yeah, Let's do it. As always, thank you so much for watching and continuing to be on this journey with me. Like I said, I'll be doing a video soon with some fun updates on the channel and what to expect moving forward into this next arc. So I'll see you very soon. If you enjoyed the video, please comment, like, subscribe. If you want to support the channel, become a member on YouTube, or I will be launching Patreon in the very near future. I'll see you all once again very soon. Take care. Bye.